Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our introduction to JavaScript. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting. Now, specifically in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to create some basic validation for some input fields on what will ultimately become a form. Now, for right now, we're not going to focus on form or the actual submission process, but I wanted to sort of get us started down that path in a shorter video that focuses just on the JavaScript side of things and specifically on some basic validation. Now, to help us get started, I've created what will effectively be a piece of a larger project here where we have some arguments that can be put into text fields and some labels, pretty much basic input from a user. Maybe you're collecting new account information, whatever the case might be. Now, as you can see here, I have my first name and my email address. And the idea is that we want to be able to do some very basic validation with each of those fields after collecting the information off of the HTML or out of the elements. And we want to do that validation when we click this submit button. Now, again, we're not going to be using forms and we're not actually going to be submitting this to the web server. We're just going to focus on the behavior on the client side so that we can see how we would go about handling some of the logic. And we're going to try to embellish this just a little bit. In other words, we're going to tell the user or attempt to tell the user exactly what they did or didn't get right. Now, take a second to do a screenshot of this layout here, or just pause the video and then go grab your favorite IDE. We're going to go ahead and create a blank HTML file. And I'm just going to call this one validate _01. Again, the name's not great. You can call them whatever you'd like to, but we want to go ahead and save the file. And in this case, I'm going to continue to save it in my Apache folder. Probably end up moving it around later on, but there we go. Again, call it validate _01. And then much like in the earlier videos, I am going to do all of the scripting in the document itself. I'm going to put it at the top of the document. We're going to also do some basic style, probably going to keep that in line. And then ultimately what we want to do is push all of this out. But for right now, though, what we're going to do is we're going to try to follow the image or the layout that we had earlier in this video, starting with a couple of labels. And I am going to go ahead and get into the habit of specifying what the labels are for. And so you want to think about this. This is going to be the label that's for the first name. So we're just going to go ahead and call it first name, whether you use underscores or not, doesn't really matter. Just you cannot use spaces. Optionally, we can go ahead and specify an ID here. That, again, could be useful. In this case, I'm going to call this one first name _ label. Again, ultimately, these are probably not the best IDs and the best names. And you can ultimately improve on this, though, later on. And then what I want to do is I actually want to put something in there for the user here to offer them some guidance. So first name : followed by a space. And then depending on the layout that you want to have, you can include an optional line feed. Now, what we'd like to do here then is have our input, and our input is going to be of type text. Suppose we should just type, there we go. And then again, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and specify an ID. And these are probably going to get a little long here. We'll, again, revisit this later on. I'm going to call this one my first name _ text. For the name, I'm just going to simply use first name. We'll see why we're going to do that then later on. And then ultimately, we want to have a default value, perhaps. And at the very least, I'm just going to leave this as an empty set of quotes. And then that should be enough for us to start with. We're going to leave the default colors and everything alone. We're actually going to go back and change that as our logic permits. At this point, then, we probably want to go ahead and include a break. So we'll throw in a BR. And then ultimately, we're going to reduce this for the email address. And so let's again do a label for an email, and then ID equal to email label. Again, that part is useful, but perhaps not completely necessary. We'll talk about that in later videos about how you can leverage that ID. For right now, what we're going to do is we're going to just simply use some very basic background color changes to highlight to the user which fields are incorrect. And again, we're going to follow this up with input, a type, text again, followed by the ID. And much like before, we're just going to keep the same pattern here. So this is going to be the email text field. Name is going to be email. Again, that'll benefit us a little later on. Put a value in there right now as a default. And then lastly, then after under BR, we'll have another input. And this time the type is going to be of button. The ID for it is going to be our submit button. And again, perhaps a little bit redundant, a little bit unnecessary. And then what we want to do is we want to put a value on this one. In this case, we're going to have submit. And then if you wanted to, we could just simply come in here and we could specify the style. And again, to try to keep it somewhat similar to what we have in the original drawing, I'm going to stick with color that should look okay on the screen. We'll just stick with that cadet blue. It worked out for us in an earlier video. And then lastly, the most important piece that we have not yet done is our on click. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to tie us back to the JavaScript function that's going to run when we push this particular button. Now, at this point, let's just go ahead and save this. Let's go find it in File Explorer and let's pull it up in our web browser. I apologize, some of this is off screen because I've got multiple monitors, but there you go. There's our basic validate _01 with our email, our first name with our email and a submit button. And again, we don't really have it styled well or anything like that. So we can go back and improve on that. But again, for this video, we're focusing on the functionality. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to come up here at the top of our file here in our HTML, in our head. This is where we're going to go ahead and add our script. And again, like I mentioned earlier in the video, we're just going to keep the JavaScript inside of the HTML. Ultimately, if you were happy with this, then you would perhaps push this out into a separate JavaScript file, be able to share it among other HTML applications or forms. And then what we want to have here is a function that I'm just going to call it rather generically validate. And the idea here is that it's going to go through and validate whatever fields we want to have validated. Now, there's going to be a little bit of logic in here that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on. There's definitely many different ways that you can go about doing this. You can stop at the first error, or you can continue on through and then highlight multiple fields. Again, it just depends on what kind of behavior you want for your application. But the key thing that we're going to leverage here is going to be some of the JavaScript string methods. And I've got on our screen here a couple of resources from the W3 schools, specifically the JavaScript string methods, as well as the JavaScript string reference. The JavaScript string methods are basically just the basic ones. Probably you could argue the most commonly used ones. One that we're going to be interested in is going to be the string length. You probably can already recognize what some of these might do. 2 uppercase, 2 lowercase, this basically converts the string into a specific case. The trim function combined with the trim start and the trim end are kind of convenient, but basically it removes extra white space at the beginning, end, or both ends of a string in case the user accidentally hit the space bar or something along those lines. So it's kind of useful. And the string split function, which we will definitely use in later videos. The rest of the functions here, hopefully their names are pretty descriptive. And then if you come over here to the JavaScript string reference, again, there's some of the ones that you saw on the other page, but the one that we're going to be using is going to be this includes. And so what I want to do is I want to quickly take a look at this and see that the includes method simply returns true if a string contains a specific string or substring. And the reason we would need something like this is, if you recall, the goal is to validate the information that is being entered in by the user. Now, the first name, there's a number of different ways we could consider validating it. We're going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to check the length of the first name. You could argue that there should be a minimum number of letters in a first name. We're just going to keep it simple. We're going to check to make sure that the string length of first name is in fact something greater than 0. However, with the email address, that gets a little more interesting here, because what you've got is you've got the possibility of having multiple different types of email addresses, underscores, numbers. And instead, what we want to do is we want to think a little bit about patterns. Now, we aren't going to talk about regular expressions in this particular video. We're going to try to leave that for later videos. I've got some videos already with regular expressions in different languages. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to think about what would be the minimum requirements for an email address, perhaps a minimum length. It would have to have an ampersand in it. Specifically, it would have to have only one ampersand, but we won't get to that in this video. We're just going to start down this process. And it would have to have at least one period in it. And again, that gets very, very complicated when you start looking at regular expressions. Basically, what we want to do is use or exercise some of our JavaScript string functions. Now, with all that being said, what we can do is we can come back here to our validate function. And what I want to do is I simply want to go through and create some basic checks for each of the fields after we've collected them out of the text boxes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start off with sort of a flag variable that will tell us whether we are or are not, in fact, valid. So we're going to say, let valid equal to false. And so we're going to start off with it being false to begin with. And if we successfully go through all of the parsing, then we will switch that over to true. Actually, what we can do here is we'll switch the logic around. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I just thought about it. We're probably going to keep it a little simpler here. So we're going to say let valid equal to true. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and capture the first name. So we're going to say let first name equal to. And if you recall from the earlier videos, we can leverage the document dot get element by ID. And again, this is where we want to be careful about what ID we've chosen. And so we want to pull the information out of the first name underscore text, and we want to specify the value. We want to do the same thing with the email. So we'll say let email equal to document dot get element by ID, our email underscore text, and again, the dot value. And at this point, we've at least captured the information on the HTML page. It may not be correct. It may not even be filled in, but these functions will at least make sure that we have 0 length strings. In other words, basically you can assume that your first name and your email are in fact strings. And from there, what that means is that you could start building logic around checking them. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to check to see what the length is of the first name. So we have our length, and if first name dot length is less than or equal to 0, then basically what that indicates to us is that there is a problem with the first name field. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and set a valid equal to false. And then what we will additionally do is we will take and modify using document.getElement by ID, and then take that first name underscore text ID, and just simply focus in on the style of that particular element. And so what you can do is you can change, for instance, the properties associated with the style for that particular element. And again, nice way for it to really stand out is to do something with, for instance, the background color. And so what we'll do here is we'll simply change the background color to some other value. I just realized that my autocomplete is not going to give us any options here. No, it does not look like it will. And so what we want to do is then we'll pull up our options for the style.background color. And so what you'll want to do is go find the documentation on the style color property. We covered this in an earlier video, and you can see here some examples. Hopefully this will refresh your memory, that you can just simply use the names for the colors, or you can use their hexadecimal values, or technically you can also do RGB. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to start just with the named colors. And so what we're going to do is whenever the user forgets to enter in one of the fields, or there's a problem with one of the fields, then we will simply set the background color to that field, or of that field rather, to red. Now, what we want to also do is when there isn't a problem, we want to go back to some sort of default. And for right now, what we're going to do is we're just simply going to specify the default as being white. We could also do green. Again, you can play around with this and come up with all sorts of different ways to go about doing this. And then what we'll do is we'll do the exact same thing now with our email address as well. So if our email dot length, and I'm just now noticed that for whatever reason, the length was not showing up for the first name, but it did for the email. Again, this seems to be an IDE issue. You might get some different behavior with respect to this, but the email.length, and again, what we want to do is make sure that it is a minimum length. And so there's a number of different ways that you can go about looking at it. The very shortest length that you could technically have for an email address would be a single character followed by an @ sign, followed by a single character, a period, and then a single character for a total of 5 characters. So in other words, if your email.length is less than 5, or the email dot include and we're looking to see that it includes the ampersand if that is equal to false, or email include a period equal to false. If any of those 3 conditions turn out to be true, then basically what we want to do is we again want to change the background color, not of the first name, but of the email text. We also want to change valid equal to false. And then if it's okay, we'll simply then change the background color back to white. Now at this point, hopefully we don't have any typos in our JavaScript, or for that matter in our HTML. What we want to do is come out here to our page. We'll refresh it one more time. And then what we can do is we can just click our submit button. Uh-oh, we do seem to have a problem. Let's go see if we can figure out exactly where we've got a problem in our logic. So let's go through this one more time here. All right, so we've got a couple of things here looking at the JavaScript that we need to fix. The most obvious one, and the reason why nothing actually happened, was because we forgot to wire up the on-click event. It's probably a good idea whenever you're doing web development, as soon as you start writing the function, essentially the function template or the placeholder for the function, just to go ahead and include it here. And so in this case, I want to make sure to include the validate function for the on-click. Scanning through the code, I do see a couple of things that I've missed. I've actually called it the function include. Misspelled this one here, so it's includes. So you want to make sure and correct those. Again, depending on what IDE you have, you'll get different support. Some of this is going to have to be, I won't call it memorization, but just a little bit of care on your part. Let's see if we've got any other problems right off the bat. I think we should be good. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's come back out to our web browser and refresh. And then if we select submit, both the first name and the email address fields turn red. And again, you could follow this up with an alert, with another element on the page. As a matter of fact, we can go ahead and do that in just a second, sort of to include a final step in this. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and just put my name in, and I want to hit the submit button again. And you'll notice that the first field is no longer red. And again, you can go about it different ways as far as resetting the field or the text background color. As a matter of fact, you can actually utilize different events, including the on change event, for some of the controls. But what we want to do now is we want to see if we've got our email working correctly here. And you can see here that what we can do here is put in, for instance, this Yahoo address, and we can select submit, and you can see again it does match the basic pattern. If I forget the @ sign and hit submit, then you can see here that it also clearly does not work. And then lastly, if we put the @ sign in and delete the period, we submit again, there is not, it's not going to be valid. So we got some basic validation combined with some functionality in our form. And again, if you submit, see here, for some reason it's stopped responding. Let's see if we can get this one to work again. There we go. We'll select that, and then there we go. All right. So what we can do now is we can go back here into our code, and just to demonstrate how you can take an additional step here as far as communicating with the user, we can add a p tag down here in the body. In other words, after all of this, we can just simply have a empty p tag with a message. I am going to go ahead and give it an ID equal to message. And then just to give us a little bit of room to work with, we're going to go ahead and include a BR tag. And then what we'll do here is we're going to leverage whenever there is a issue, we're going to create a message. So let message equal to empty quotes. And then what we will do here is every time there is a problem, we'll simply say message equal to, and then in this case, we're going to say error, please provide a valid first name. And then what we'll do is we will simply add to the existing message whenever there is another message. So down here, this will be error, please provide a valid email. And in order to do so, what we're going to do is we're going to say message is equal to message, and then we're just simply going to add the rest of the message on there. You can, of course, include extra spaces if you want to. At the end, a new line. There's all sorts of different possibilities there. Again, it depends on exactly what you're trying to do. Keep in mind, though, you're going to be inserting this inside of a p tag, so we won't be able to use HTML elements. We'll actually have to use text. So at this point, what we'll do is we'll simply add, to keep it simple, a couple of spaces at the end of each of the messages. And then what we can do is we can check the message length. And so if message dot length is greater than 0, what we will do is we will say document dot get element by ID. We're going to grab the message. And what we'll do is we can set the inner HTML or inner text for this particular element, because again, you can put HTML inside of a p tag. And we'll just simply set that equal to message. If the message length was in fact not greater than 0, we will just simply clear out the contents of that p tag. Now, what we can do is come back over here, we'll refresh this one more time, and we hit submit. Again, we've got both of the errors. Let's see if we can figure out real quick what happened with the contents of our p tag. So we have our message ID. All right. Let's come back over here one more time, just checking to make sure that I've got my ID spelled correctly. Everything should be fine there. Now let's temporarily switch this over to inner text. We'll save this real quick. Refresh this one more time and submit. All right, so I seem to have a typo here that we'll have to figure out real quick. So if we come back over here and refresh our page, making sure that we've got the most recent version of the code, and then let's go through our function real quick to see if we can figure out exactly what we've added. And so I think my typo right here has to do with my message variable. Looks like when I appended the message, I think that should be it. So again, a little bit related to which ID you use. Now let's go ahead and refresh our page one more time and hit submit. And you can see that now I get an error message where that p tag is, in addition to having my text fields light up in red. So hopefully this video was useful. Basically, the goal behind this is for you to see how you can use JavaScript for validation of some of your input arguments, but also how to use it in order to manipulate both the style and the content of your HTML page. The style being manipulated through styles, CSS, and the structure, even in the content, being manipulated using the HTML. Now, real quick, I do want to make one change back here just to point out that the typo that we had was actually hiding the fact that this actually works. So we could also simply include this as inner HTML. We'll go ahead and save this, come back out here, and then we'll go through and we'll go ahead and do this one more time. Well, why would you care, or what's the difference? Well, the difference is if you're only interested in text, in other words, certain elements only have text, that's fine. You would use the inner text method, or rather the property. The inner HTML actually allows for you to dynamically add elements to your HTML DOM, the document object model. So in other words, if in your message you wanted to have a URL, well, then you would simply then craft that in the message, including the A tags and the BR tags if you wanted new lines. So again, there's a couple of different possibilities. So inner HTML and inner text can both be useful. Inner text will simply dump whatever the contents was that you were trying to write to that particular tag. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.